Okay, so it's time. Welcome to those of you who are here. So uh, last week we discussed the matter of left populism, and I would not claim that we have uh, brought the matter to rest, since that debate whether left populism is the only viable alternative to right populism is going to continue, and people will continue to address it. But I wanted to focus today on a very different problem area, which I think is relevant to both left and right populisms, namely the political form in which the populist challenge appears. It's pretty remarkable that in the works of Laclau and Mouffe, and I think generally who follow them, the so-called Essex School in the United Kingdom, the topic is restricted implicitly, without even saying so, to populism in opposition. This is all the more remarkable, as Nadia Urbinati points out in a chapter of her book. I don't know if I assigned that chapter, that Laclau was, for a significant period, an influential advisor of Christina Kirchner. In other words, he was playing a governmental role himself. And the same would have been true, I think, for Chantal Mouffe if the relations between her and Podemos continued, or if Podemos remained within the paradigm that she advocated. And I think that those two issues are connected. So it is remarkable to restrict populism to only what I would call the movement form. Now, of course, how many forms does populism appear in? In my title, I have movement, party, government, and regime. And in the actual discussion, I will divide government into two categories, following an argument of Zsolt Enyedi in Central European University. And in fact, even regime, I will bifurcate by raising the question of whether a populist regime is a hybrid regime or authoritarian one, distinguishing between them two regime forms. So in the end, I'm dealing with 6 forms. I mean, maybe that is the prudent reason why Laclau and Mouffe avoid the discussion of organizational forms, since the thing can exist in many different organizational forms, though I don't buy that particular justification. So 4 or 5 organizational forms, maybe even 4 to 6 organizational forms need to be distinguished, and the thresholds between them when one actually steps over the line from one to the other, either conceptually or in actual historical political fact. In fact, and now I'm adding another form, populism could exist only as a critique of existing societies, in which case I think to distinguish it from other forms of critique, radical democratic generally, would be almost impossible. I mean, after all, populist authors like Mouffe or Laclau, when they criticize existing regimes, revive arguments that have been there in the history of democracy ever since the French Revolution, I would say even the British or the English revolutions of the 17th century. So in that sense, populism can exist in the form of a critique, but only thing we can say is that the critics adopt arguments which already exist, and it is their longer term intentions that would define them as populists at all. As an oppositional movement, however, populism can be understood as distinct. And we have examples of such a movement. The United States, the Tea Party, in Venezuela, the Bolivarian circles, in Hungary, the civic circles. Certainly, these were all at some point purely oppositional movements, and yet, given our definition of populism, and I keep on returning to these dimensions: claim of popular sovereignty, the role of a thin ideology, chain of equivalences, the part-whole logic, the friend-enemy logic, the logic of embodiment apply to these movements also. It is a little more complicated, however, to describe this phenomenon, because movements that otherwise one would not call as populist in toto, for example, Polish solidarity, that has been extensively discussed by the Turin group. I also spent some time in describing them, and of course the actors themselves have described it. Almost never call it a populist movement, but at most indicate that it has a dimension. This dimension roughly corresponds to the distinction between pragmatists and fundamentalists, or radical reformers and revolutionaries. But in solidarity, one will find such distinctions in other movements as well, notably the green movements. The German Greens have often been described in terms of justice antinomy. Given this fact, it is interesting how a purely populist movement can be, that it is not so easy to distinguish a purely populist movement from an antinomic movement which has a populist dimension. Okay, that's oppositional movement. Populism, of course, as all of you know from your own countries, can also dominate, or can also convert itself into a party form. I was going to speak about thresholds, and the threshold between a movement and a party is generally described as the organizational threshold. A party has distinguished elites, has an internal hierarchy, often has a formal organization enforcing its rules. And historically, this is less and less true of parties today, they also involve formal membership. And in this sense, certainly they have things that the movement level does not have. So it's an organizational threshold that needs to be met. And sometimes it is met through self-definition. You simply declare yourself a political party. And this could mean less even than the organizational change involved, and then be restricted to only the idea of contesting elections. You declare yourself a party, the German Greens, let's say, in my memory, the most striking example of such a shift meant that they wanted to participate in elections. To meet the 5% threshold, which exists in Germany for parliamentary representation. To get enough votes to get into parliament doesn't mean that they declare their intention to serve any governmental function or to participate in governmental formations, but that was implicit in that particular case. So the threshold is organizational, but it is also a symbolic one, which may not even meet the organizational threshold. It's easy to treat the threshold of government. A populist party steps over the governmental threshold by winning an election. or doing sufficiently well as to be included in coalitions. It's not the same thing, as all of you know. In the United States, that option really doesn't exist, but it exists in lots of places. For example, the Greens, now talking about what I take to be a non-populist formation, the Greens were able, once they became members of the parliament, to participate in governments, whether in the German state level or on the federal level. So the threshold here is easy to determine, but it is harder to indicate a threshold internally between populism in government and populism as the government. As I said, I'm taking this distinction from Joel Kennedy. It should have been obvious to everybody, and in the United States, we came to realize the importance of that distinction through the Trump period, especially after 2018, when one branch of the legislature passed into democratic hands. Populism as the government means, in terms of again the threshold concept, of attaining control over all the branches of government. Now that can be a lot of governments in the federal system, which also has separation of powers, right? You have to gain control of 3 branches in the separation, and at least, let's say, the majority of state governments, which in turn have the 3-part structure. So when do you have full control over state government? This matter is extremely important politically for a populism in government. And as you will see, it leads to battles against the other branches, to gain control of the other branches within the separation of powers. The most complicated question is that of regime. You know that in the world of journalism, government and regime are treated as synonyms. Political scientists and political sociologists like ourselves, however, ought to make the distinction. Really, it's 3 distinctions: constitution, regime, and government. We know the distinction between constitution and government in the sense that constitution involves a set of rules that enable government formation and the rules for exercising governmental powers, always involving limitations, for example. But within constitutions, there is also the question of the real constitution and the formal one. Everybody who knows American politics or who has taken a political science course knows that not the whole political structure and the whole of political practices are not anticipated or described in the Constitution of the United States. That's all the more true in that case because it's an 18th century Constitution, but I'm sure that this can be done. That kind of distinction, which has been formally made by Hans Kelsen between formal Constitution and material Constitution, can be made probably for every single polity. Most amazingly, the Soviet-type societies where the real political system was not in the Constitution at all, just sometimes in terms of a single line that indicated very little. The leading role of the Communist Party did not even mention the political bureau or the central committee or the bureaucracy or its rules and practices. So the material Constitution is different than the formal one. It overlaps with it, obviously, in significant ways, but it also represents a different dimension. And it is the material Constitution that should be used to define the regime level. In other words, the rules for the political system, its ultimate structure, and the political competition and the rules for political competition within it are indeed defined by a constitution, but it is the material constitution. Say in the United Kingdom, which has no documentary constitution, there is nevertheless a constitution in this material sense, namely in the sense of a regime. Now, populism being in government or being the government is not yet uh, uh, does not yet indicate the formation of a new regime or a different regime than existed there before. And this creates several problems. One problem, again, is the threshold problem. When do we actually step over from one to the other? And secondly, whether it is one type of regime or many that represents populism in terms of this ultimately possible stage. The threshold question is difficult, but I want to indicate already in advance that making a new constitution, as in Hungary in 2011, or in Venezuela around 2000, many countries, many examples of this, does not yet mean the construction of a new regime. It does indicate, however, an interest in the regime level. This has to do with the distinction between the formal and the material constitution, but also because the formal constitution, the makers of the formal constitution, are very often under the influence of their environment, whether in Latin America or in Europe. And so they will make more concessions to the already existing regime type, in most of these cases, constitutional democracy, than they might in reality. So you could actually have reached the regime level and still have a formally constitutional democratic constitution. And conversely, you can reach the regime level constitutionally without having fully broken with what has come before. Now, what type of regime are we talking about? And here, the literature is divided between the idea that populists in power form new regime type autocracy. This is the language of János Kornai and János Kiss in Hungary, or whether, as I think the more dominant view, whether they create hybrid regimes. In other words, regimes that have elements in common with authoritarian regimes, but have elements in common with democracies too. I myself tend to this view, in spite of the fact that there are a couple of cases. Russia and Venezuela would be, I think, the ones that should be mentioned on each side, the right and the left, where the regime type that seemed to have emerged is only ritually or purely formally in the common world as constitutional democracy. Of course, the question then would arise whether in that case we can still talk about populism. My friend Gregory Yudin, a Russian student, very advanced student at the New School, has, for example, always denied, I don't even remember now his considerations, that the Putin regime is populist at all. And I think Cesar could say something about whether he would consider the Maduro regime still populist, in spite of the fact that it has gained its ability to do what it does through a history which is clearly linked to the phenomenon of populism, both as a movement and as a government and so on. Maybe it is only Cuban troops now that maintain the Maduro regime, or other forms of international connection. It is possible that in that sense, it cannot be considered populist at all. That would be an open question that we can consider in the discussion. Now, what I really want to stress, I have a little essay on the subject, which is, I think, not as complete as the lecture that I'm intending to complete today, where I focus on this issue a lot, and I warn against interpreting these 4 forms, 5 organizational forms, even 6, as a stage model. there would be a temptation to think of movement first, party second, in government third, the government fourth, uh, hybrid regime fifth, authoritarian regime sixth. And it may be that in some countries, some places, that you can reconstruct uh, a, a stage model like that. But importantly enough, uh, uh, one can point also to examples where where a stage that should be logically a later one comes first. For example, there's a party which helps to construct a movement outside. Even a government that, in order to maintain its own incumbency, constructs a movement. Indeed, constructs a party, as I think in the case of Ecuador, Correa did not really have a party when he won the presidential, but constructed something like a party once in power. So you can see that among these stages, which superficially look like a succession of stages, among these types that superficially look like a succession of stages, you can have a reversal, a historical reversal of development. And indeed, you could have skipped stages. I don't agree with my friend Kish and János Kornai that in Hungary in 2011, Fidesz just leapt from just having been elected to constructing an autocratic regime. I don't agree with them, but nevertheless, that is a possibility. It would indicate a kind of revolutionary type of populism. And yes, Fidesz does speak about the revolution of the voting booth, in this sense, treats itself as having carried out a revolution, but the reality is that it was a normal Hungarian elections under the existing rules, and those rules were bad enough to allow Fidesz to form a kind of constitution-making majority. So a revolutionary version of populism could involve the skipping of stages. But in reality, if you examine most of the historical versions, you see that that several stages have to be gone through, even before the concentration of all governmental powers, and especially before the construction of a new regime. So, given the possibility of skipping stages and giving the possibility of reversals of causality, I think we should speak about a logic rather than an actual possibility of a sequence of necessary stages. The logic, again, is based on the definition of populism. Again, I review, and you can see in my outline what the main part of that logic is, and in that sense, I think one can probably show that there is a logical relationship between what could be superficially regarded as stages, which flows from the phenomenon itself. For example, the part-whole logic implies that that once in power, making claims in terms of the popular sovereign, using only a thin ideology identifying that actor, there will be a tendency to try to assume all the governmental powers. If a part can speak in the name of the whole, then sharing governmental powers with other parts that do not speak in the name of the whole, it becomes unacceptable. Indeed, even losing an election becomes unacceptable. The fatherland or the motherland cannot be in opposition, as stated Viktor Orban. So So the whole logic implies uh, 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 that the Populist Party must be the victor of elections, and if elections are lost, then there is fraud and cheating and illegitimacy involved. And then after winning elections, the whole logic implies that power cannot be shared with others, whether Nancy Pelosi's House of Representatives or a constitutional court whose members have been appointed by previous regimes. And this is all the more implied by the friend-enemy logic, because they're not just competitors, but they are really enemies of the people with whom power cannot be shared. And this, of course, implies that the political leadership that embodies the people must be the government at the very least. Why I think that is not enough, and regime construction also is involved, I think has to do with the problems that a populist government, or the populism as the government, will inevitably encounter. Now, the causal origins of the different phases have to be discussed independently if you do not have a stage model. If you had a stage model, all you need to have is a populism formed from below, right? And then success would mean that eventually it can go through the stages. But this is not the actual history in lots of cases. As the literature repeatedly shows, populist movements can emerge from below. They can emerge from above, in a sense of being formed by governments, and they can even be formed by political parties. That's what I mean. That's what I mean by in between. This, of course, means that populist movements can be a consequence of there being something like populist governmental power, not its origins. Of course, in the case of any given populist movement, there could be a debate concerning how much of it has emerged from below and how much of it has emerged from intervention from above or the outside. The Tea Party indicates this well, where the debate is continued around the matter of it being an astroturf movement or a genuine movement, which then is furthered in its goals by external actors. The origin of populist parties, for this reason, cannot be seen, for the same reason of not having a stage model, cannot be seen as simply based on the existence of a powerful populist movement. To an important extent, their origin should be seen in terms of the problems of contemporary party systems, as Jean Cohen's article shows. In our epoch, with its catch-all parties or cartel parties, the party system's representational quality becomes seriously questionable, and populist parties emerge because of gaps of representation within the existing party systems, especially true for the cartel party thesis, which indicates the convergence of the main political parties that alternate between powers, partocracy, as it is called in Latin America, but which manage to exclude other social interests from power permanently. The shift of social democratic parties from from a welfare state orientation to at least partially neoliberal profiles indicates that a gap has opened up in the framework of representation, and this is what populist parties fill. Nevertheless, the origin of populist parties has another dimension, which is linked to the political and constitutional context, because populist parties emerge in two possible ways. Either the creation of a new party, and in lots of Western European countries, this has occurred, sometimes both on the right and the left, but it could also mean the capture of an existing party. That's in the United States, where I think it's pretty clear that the Republican Party has been captured by a version of the radical right that emerged with the Tea Party first, and which was then used and built upon by Trump. Now, the electoral system, of course, is one reason why this alternative meaning exists, where it's easy to form a new party and to get into parliament and get governmental funding thereby, which is, of course, an important precondition for efficient functioning. That's most of the West European countries. The formation of a new party is worthwhile. Where there's an electoral threshold, that's in Germany, it is more difficult. And of course, in the first past the post systems of the United States, it is even more difficult still. Under such conditions, using the system of primaries or using the system of control of funding, or relying on a leader that can reverse the historically inherited weakness of a given party, it is possible to capture an existing party. So populist parties emerge, of course, can emerge from populist movements that turn themselves into political parties, but it is successful to create such a party. It is possible to create such a party successfully where the constitutional framework allows it, and where the existing party system suffers from a significant deficit of representation. Now, of course, how populism gets to be in government is a simple matter. It has to do well enough in elections to either control a branch, as in the United States, or be sufficiently strong to be included in coalitions, which is the case in most of the European countries. Sometimes even two populist parties, as in Italy, can form a political coalition, but still Five Star or the Liga did not achieve governmental power directly through winning an election outright. So elections are the key, but then the transition between in government and the government requires significant battles on the governmental level. So as you see in the Polish case, for example, the Justice and Freedom Party comes to power with respect to the parliamentary majority, which allows it to form an executive, but it has a 4-year period of battle with the courts, which eventually is successful. So to become the government, you have to fight against the other branches. In the case of coalitions, this is even more difficult because the coalition partners, of course, will resist, and in order to stay in the coalition, you have to accept that in many aspects of patronage and appointment, they will control. This is even true for two populist parties. And by the way, the marriage of the two in Italy has not been a happy one. I'm not sure. Can't say exactly now. My memory is not good enough. Whether it lasted 2 years or three, in any case, it did collapse with one of the partners then going with a more established party to form the next coalition. So it's not easy to capture the governmental power when you're in government, but there are ways that populism already in power has. Having the executive under modern government is a huge advantage. The fact that Trump lost that fight probably is a mark of the weakness of his methods, his lack of familiarity, and his team's lack of familiarity with government, and perhaps the weak representation of the populist support that initially he has been able to get. I mean, I note, however, that in the election of 2020, he nevertheless gets more votes than any American presidential candidate ever before, even if 7 million less than his competitor. So using populism, the populism of using the resources of being in power allows for expansion, but it is not, of course, automatic, and failures are also possible. I want to end with a discussion of the consequences for both movements and parties when populism becomes a party and a government, and perhaps even a regime. On the level of movements, one could say that having a populist mobilization is not necessarily negative from point of view of the world of movements, and does not in itself diminish and reduce the possibility of other mobilizations. During, for example, the epoch of the Tea Party and Trump in the United States, other movements continue to exist, to mobilize, and sometimes achieve notable successes, as the election of 2018 was such a success, but clearly also the Black Lives Matter mobilization, the continued mobilization of women, and of course even regional initiatives continue to exist in that period. The populist movement does not in itself attempt to repress or suppress other movements. It's a significant difference from fascism. There's so many things that we can find in common between especially right-wing populisms and fascism, but as Federico Finkelstein has pointed out, the use of violence in the movement level is not an important factor. I know that January 6th seems to go against that, and there have been previous confrontations between white supremacists and Black Lives Matter, which indicated the propensity to violence on that right-wing side. But I think that it would be unfair and incorrect to represent the whole Tea Party movement, for example, as prone to use violent means against other political movements. The most one can say on this level is that populist movements, as well as other movements, are jointly or commonly components of civil society, are utilizing the resources of civil societies and indeed of constitutional protections for those resources, and remain in civil society as long as they remain a movement. Though I think the distinction which I put in bold in my outline of not being for civil society, uh, even being in civil society, is, I think, a relevant one, since populist movements, in terms of their ideologies and in terms of the chain of equivalences that they and their leaders construct, indicate their special status. Civil society is pluralistic, whereas they claim a special status of representing the genuine people or the authentic people or the underdog in the case of left-wing movements, in the sense of denying that kind of quality to other social movements. The consequence for political parties is apparently similar, since a populist party competes with other parties, especially when it is out of party, when it is not yet in power. But here, a significant difference, Nadia Urbinati has greatly stressed this, appears, namely that populism is anti-party. Even as it forms a party, it denounces the party political contestation in the political field. The other parties are narrow representations of self-interest, whereas we are the embodiment of the people as a whole. We are imagining a democracy which would be beyond the contestation of selfish and self-seeking political parties. So, in a sense, the party system is more explicitly attacked than civil society is attacked on the movement level. And this becomes especially important, of course, when the populist party comes to power, because it now has the instruments for acting against other political parties. In this context, I think one should note, and I had some difficulty thinking of where exactly to include this, that populist parties, populist governments see themselves in terms of that implicit stage model, which historically or empirically cannot be really demonstrated. In other words, they see themselves as succeeding social movements, even where they have created them, in the sense that they can be correctly described, as Jean Cohen describes them, following also Herbert Kitchell, as movement parties when they are parties, and as movement governments, movement party governments when they are governments. Instead of stages, there is a kind of cancellation preservation involved here. It is cancellation because the movement party no longer recognizes other movements, if it ever did, as legitimate competitors. And the movement government suppresses movements, including even movements that helped it to come to political power. But nevertheless, the movement persona is maintained, and for a government also the party electoral persona. Many people have described, we did too, populist governments as engaged in permanent campaigns, being permanent campaigns. As it has been said about Trump, he did not like being in government very much and participating in the governmental process, but he adored participating in rallies, in electoral type rallies, which were continued to be held during his administration. And this is explained also by the phenomenon of populist governments describing themselves as being in opposition even when they are in power. They're in opposition because other elites remain important and they control lots of aspects of the political process. For example, the media elites in the United States remain so powerful that a campaign against them with the help of the internet is necessary. But even beyond them, a term that was invented, I think, in Turkey, but has been adopted by Bannon and is used elsewhere too. The deep state remains in power even when we are the government. By the way, this is another step toward regime construction because the very idea of the deep state means that there is government and there is the state. Gene always says what they call the deep state is just the state, but it doesn't really matter. The terminology doesn't matter because the point is that civil service officials, people who have come through the bureaucratic ladder, people who have structurally important power positions that do not depend on the government in power, whether in the military or in the system of courts or in the system of administration, really hundreds of thousands of people ultimately remain a challenge just because they want to carry out things the way they have always carried them out. And so even in power, one must be a movement against power. This is the structure of the argument. And it is continuous with the party having remained a movement in some significant way, as Gene describes. But now the party movement is the government, and it has to remain a movement in the sense of mobilizing people, but it has to also play the role of an electoral party in terms of its battle to win the next election. It's always the next election that matters, never the one that already occurred, because it has not sufficiently empowered the genuine representatives of the people. In this sense, then, populism has an answer when in government or the government to its own failures. Now, of course, people have pointed out that the type of party's populism, the party movement party's populist form, is already not very programmatic. Generally speaking, there is no program. An amazing thing about the 2020 election, the Republicans, for the first time, had no platform. What does that mean? I mean, a party enters an election by producing a detailed map of what it has done, what it will do, what its plans are, and all the rest, and asks for people vote in order to approve not just people, but platforms. I mean, that's traditional for American politics. The Democratic Party did have such a platform in the last election, influenced by different segments of the party, among whom compromises have been made. The Republicans, not only because perhaps of their internal division, but also because of the lack of a need to even have one, did not even have a political platform. Well, when in power, nevertheless, people expect things from you. Even when you don't have a platform, you suggest that things will be happening. And one of the things that one expects is that the supporters will gain material benefits. In the case of a populist movement, that of course means lots of supporters have expectations that once in power, things will change. Things were bad for us because of the political power of those who are ultimately our enemies, the elites or the establishment. But now we should be in power. And yet those things do not happen. Populist governments, of course, they have successes in some areas. And if they don't, they pretend to have had them, but they clearly also have notable failures. And this also has to do with the weakness of populism in government and not yet the government, is because it has to make compromises with those who are presumably or ultimately part of the framework of the enemy. And the idea of being in power and yet not being in power, being a movement in power that is not yet the power, is one way of explaining failures. This, of course, means lots of things for the framework of political of the political framework. It means, first of all, that the relationship between the populist government and those with whom it has to deal becomes more antagonistic than in the case of ordinary governments. Perhaps the exception is revolutionary governments, which tend to jail their opponents and eliminate people radically from public life. Not being able to do that also because of its participation in democratic imaginary, populism has to fight its battles on a symbolic level. But this, of course, means a dramatic exacerbation of the symbolic framework of conflict. Societal polarization is, of course, already a factor in populists coming to power in the first place. But being in power, they dramatically exacerbate that polarization. Things come to a point where ordinary aspects of government can no longer be carried out. So, for example, in the Trump case, the promise to reconstruct healthcare and to construct a much better healthcare system, which is never articulated on the platform level of what it would have been, becomes impossible because of the polarization of the country, where simply no votes could be forthcoming from the other side. And the reverse also applies. We're in that situation now, with one populist party being so powerful in one branch of government, so they are still in government in the United States, namely through the weapon of the filibuster, they are still in government through the Senate, actually achieving even minimal tasks of government around which the constituencies of all parties, including the populists themselves, may agree, becomes extremely difficult. Of course, I already said that accountability that is escaped by the fiction of not being in power when you are in power. But there is, of course, a problem with this, namely that too many failures become basis for new counter-mobilization, and electorally they represent threats to the survival of populists, even in power. This is one of the reasons why they turn to repression or authoritarian steps extremely early. If you're not achieving results when in government, and after a while the blame game, the expense of the deep state or inherited elites wears thin, you must reduce the visibility of your failure. The media become all important in all these settings, and it's actually documentable just as much for left populist settings as it is for the right, that a battle against the media commences early and generally culminates in very large level of control of published and even electronic media. Hungary would be, on the right-wing side, one example of how much control over the media can be achieved by a populism that has become the government. But I think on the left, Venezuela would be a good example of the elimination also of alternative media. Different settings, this is a different problem. The success of the Trump government with respect to printed and the traditional electronic media has been extremely thin. In the end, they kept what they had in the first place, namely Fox News and some newspapers that supported them, but gained control over no others. And this, of course, is also connected to being only in government and not controlling all the governmental branches. The courts you can pack, but to what extent the courts will give up protecting all the various spheres of the public and of civil society remains a questionable that. Of course, the courts themselves can be targeted, and this you can see well in the Hungarian and Polish cases on the right, and the cases of Venezuela, Ecuador, and even Bolivia ultimately on the left. So you target the media. When you can't fully succeed in that, you then also target the courts. You may target the courts even earlier, obviously. And then even if all that doesn't succeed, you have to tamper with elections. The electoral rules will be also changed to your benefit. Interestingly, we don't have a single case where electoral rules have been so transformed that the other side cannot win, formally at least. This may be a definitional feature of populism. Fascism abandons free and fair elections altogether and replaces them with referenda, which are tightly controlled and even falsified. Populisms do not go that far, and in this sense, even Russia. In Russia, candidacies are suppressed, so you can have elections, but you can't run candidates. That gets pretty close to having replaced the electoral structure by an authoritarian one. Venezuela is an interesting case. After a lost election, a constituent assembly is called, and the electoral rules for that are very much in favor of the presidency. But how long can this constituent assembly function in Venezuela before you're going to have the next legislative and presidential elections? Can they get away with even not having those? I think will be, in the Venezuelan case, an open question. I want to end with constitutional politics here, because logically targeting the media, the courts, the electoral rules would lead to eventually targeting the Constitution itself, to reorganize everything in such a way as to make incumbency permanent. But of course, this comes early in some of the cases. In fact, in Venezuela, it was it was shortly after the electoral process, the regular election that the presidency won, that the constituent process was initiated, and in Hungary too, relatively quickly after the electoral victory of Fidesz. But in other cases, it comes later. What I think is interesting, though, is that it doesn't stop. This is as Talleyrand phrased it, possibly a function of the compliments that vice accords to virtue. Hypocrisy was what he was talking about, but the virtue has to do with the international environment. If you do a constitution early, it's all the more problematic to escape that international environment. In this sense, if you look at just the original text of the Fidesz Constitution, you can find lots of objectionable elements in it, but nevertheless, it's a constitution like other constitutions. It takes, Barbara doesn't agree, but this would be, I think, something that one could really then analyze. But what is undeniable, and I'm sure she's not going to deny it, is that immediately after the enactment of the Constitution, even during the transitional rules, and then further constitutional amendments, the Constitution is continued to be changed. In other words, if you do it early, the compliments that vice pays to virtue have to be greater. And of course, in the end, you're sorry for having done so, because it limits you in some possible ways. And so the process is opened, and astonishing how much Venezuela and Hungary in this respect are similar, where immediately, or not even, the constitution is not yet in effect in Venezuela, when the transitional rules are reenacted, and where a constitutional amendment process is opened and reopened. In a Latin American country, the issue is always re-eligibility of the president. This, in a parliamentary system like Hungary, you don't have. In principle, Orban can be prime minister to the end of his life. There's no limit to that re-election. It depends only on winning the election, or perhaps the choice of his party, which is not likely to ever, of course, in that case, change. In Latin America, there is usually a re-eligibility issue. Interestingly, right, the Chavez, the Morales, well, you can't even call it the Morales Constitution in Bolivia. It's a compromise product of different political groups. But the initial constitutions have non-re-eligibility. Why didn't Chavez write one without it? Well, in Latin America, that was always an important issue. And earlier presidencies have been attacked precisely for staying in office for indefinite amounts of time. So it's always written in. That's the complement of virtue to vice. But the vice in the end, that's a complement of vice to virtue, rather. But the vice in the end is dominant, because you do want to be reelected. And Chavez wanted to be indeed reelected, and went through a complicated process of trying to change the constitution. And Morales too, in the end, comes to ultimately to grief over that issue. So the constituent process continues, and it is a mark, I end with this, of a logic toward constructing a new kind of regime. But it is a process that cannot be simply achieved on the constitutional level. Constitutional politics has other instruments, for example, court packing. You cannot get re-eligibility through a referendum, as Chavez could not. So you need some other instance to make the decision for you. Fortunately for him, he had the court, which decided that you cannot take away the right of the Venezuelan people, or even some treaty obligations of Venezuela cannot be violated by having term limits. And so in principle, he could have run for another term. And in Morales' case, it was yet another type of decision of the Constitutional Court, the plurinational Constitutional Court, that it is called in Bolivia. So the stages and the steps toward constructing a regime continue under populism, but usually it requires further measures, repressive measures with respect to other independent aspects of social life, including even possible alternative movements, that regime construction can be fully carried out. So I stop at this, and the floor is open to your questions. Well, strictly speaking, a movement in civil society is trying to influence power through indirect means. In other words, without grabbing power and without replacing incumbents by their own people or their own elites. Is this ever true for a social movement? Would be a reasonable question. But I think that there are some social movements that one can use in lots of countries to illustrate this. For example, feminism. I mean, there must be some countries with women's parties. I think it exists. But on the whole, women mobilize, organize, demonstrate, participate in events, even give support to political candidates without necessarily trying to project their movement activists into power. It's a natural option for women because to the extent that there are women in parties and women in governments, they would have receptors, as Habermas once called them. So speaking in a public sphere, demonstrating, organizing, is not without audience also in the realm of power. Women can afford not to create a party and remain strongly influential. And to different social movements, this point would apply in a different way. Your question, though, refers to a populist movement. So is the Tea Party, let's say, to take a pure example of a populist movement, is it satisfied with trying to just influence the Republican Party? Or does its very nature, the type of demands, the type of self-understanding that its members have, imply that it wants to capture a party and thereby enter into government, right? So the replacement in the case of Tea Party, well, obviously it's a capture issue. In the case of Five Star in Italy, it would be directly to enter into government. Was the goal of Five Star from the outset to enter into government? So oppositional populism can at least be charged, as Elena just did, with having that intention all along. It is in civil society, it is mobilizing in a way that civil society movements mobilize. It is participating in public discussions and so on. But it is secretly, one could say, or even openly, aiming at something else. It's aiming at the stage model, basically, that I said was really not a necessary feature of populism, but it could be in some cases. In the case of a movement, that would be the implication. We want to become a party. We want to become a government. We want to capture a party and become a government. This could be implied from the outset. And I think this is a reasonable charge. On the basis of my understanding of what populism is, it's also a logically strong charge. Because if you think that you're not just a part, but you are the people, you are the voice of the people as a whole, if you think that other movements are really enemies of the people, then the only way that you can carry out your goals and defeat your enemies is by governmental power. The Tea Party was not in a position to suppress American feminism. I am sure that feminism was already thought of as an enemy by most Tea Partiers and their leaders and even their fundraisers. And ecology too was thought to be a hoax, in that sense, a dramatic misrepresentation of our industrial and political world. But the Tea Party as such was not in a position to do anything about this. And so to the extent that you have this friend-enemy concept, to the extent that you think that you are the true voice of the people, logically, you want to be the government or in government and then the government. But the democratic assumption for that is becoming a political party. So even though there is no empirically demonstrable stage model for how movement, party, government, regime interrelate, Nevertheless, for a populist movement, namely oppositional populism, that logic is an implication of their self-understanding. Of course, they will fail lots of levels, to even form a political party. Lots of movements don't manage that. To capture a political party should be even more difficult. It took the very, very significant weakness of the American Republican Party and its ideology, the crisis really of Reaganism within the American Republican Party and within its constituency, that allowed for taking over that party. Trump took it over because it was so weak. In the case of a strong Republican Party run by the established Republicans, and Cheney and Romney, Trump's opponents, are very established Republicans. Romney was a presidential candidate. Cheney is the daughter of a very powerful Secretary of Defense. These were very established Republicans. Obviously, they were very weak, and they remain weak now when they try to oppose Trump. So the weakness of a party is the opportunity. But it doesn't mean, Elena, that the logic is based only on the weakness of the existing parties or the representational structure of the existing party framework. It also comes from the populist self-understanding. The two kind of interact. The space is opened up, and it's not just the weakness of the Romneys and the other establishment Republicans, the Cheneys and so on. It is also on the left, the weakness of social democracy in our epoch, which create a space which obviously will be entered in different ways in different political systems. So that space must be there or must be opened up, it must be created. But the populist self-understanding means we want to occupy a space like that if it opens up. The Tea Party in 2008, 9, whenever it was first formed, right, it could not have imagined the Trump presidency. I mean, who could anybody in the United States imagine it? None of us could imagine this thing, right? And nevertheless, there is a kind of logical link. Scotchbull talked about that in our lecture series in a very great way. But, in terms of what I'm doing, I can only illustrate on a level of a logic that, in a way, Trumpism is created before Trump. Is that true for Orban? I saw such a space in even my relatively early writings on the Hungarian Democratic Forum. And I thought that in a sense, a radical populist perspective, I'm not even sure if I called it that, was possible, and there was a political space for it. But it required the political structure of the regime change to open up that space more and more. And Orban's brilliance is that he saw that. He saw that he wanted to enter into the space which was not sufficiently occupied by, and only Barbara knows these names, by István Csurka and Tordján. Orban saw that space even better than his advisors. Some of them are friends of mine, like George Bence and András Kovács and these nice people whom Barbara probably knows of. But he saw more clearly than they did where the space was and occupied it. So it could be a leader or a group that discovers the space, or it could be something like Trump, who just does his own thing of media politics and falls into that space which others, there are some others who want to occupy it, but others do not have the media knowledge to do it successfully. So there is this type of link. It would validate a stage model, except of course you have many cases where the relationship is reversed. where a political figure sees the opportunity and then contributes to the creation of a movement or a mobilization. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yes, sure, Cesar.
Yes, I'm also I'm curious about this idea of the relationship between the parties and the movements. In some experiences, when you experience with these populist movements which get to the government, they don't only create this situation of struggling against the deep state or struggling against the other movements or the other parties, but the populist movement party also destroys the system of political parties. And I remember that it happened with Fujimori when Fujimori get to the government in Peru in the 1990s. And in 1992, he made a coup d'etat, and then he called for the for the creation of the new constitution. But the new parties that participated in the parliament were not. Were some of them were of the former one, and the others present themselves as if they were independent parties. And also in some point also before winning the elections, Fujimori present himself as an independent against the traditional political elites and against the traditional political movements. So is this kind of situations also a typical issue with other experiences of populism? I don't know too much about the European one, but I will be curious about this issue. And here in the United States is not the case, because even if the Republican Party is very weak and it was the opportunity for Trump to get a prominent position, he didn't destroy the party yet, or he didn't destroy the double, the two places that both the Democratic and the Republican Party have here at the United States.
Well, this is, of course, the point of Gene's article, pretty much the argument, namely that the creation of a populist movement party is destructive both for the movement on a movement level and destructive also on a party level, that it affects, it demobilizes civil society in some way, moving its energies in a direction where civil self-government, the politics of influence are disempowered, but it destroys the party system too. That's your argument, because when a populist party forms and it becomes a movement party, which means lots of things: looser organization than political parties, more fundamentalist postures in politics, lack of desire to develop programs, focusing on the media as a terrain of democratic competition, which is the most important aspect perhaps. Audience democracy, Bernard Manin and Nadia Urbinati focus on this. When they do this, other parties must follow. Or at least there is an incentive for other parties to follow also, which then means the political framework is occupied. Urbinati stresses this, factions. If you remember, during the early period of modern constitutional democracy, parties as such were denounced by Republican thinkers as factions, people who are going to fragment the political framework, who make the constitutional structure unworkable, who make rule-governed behavior impossible, destroy the constitutional structure altogether. And political parties, as they have historically developed, one of the things they always had to show is that they were not factions of this kind, that even though they were involved in what Chantal Mouffe calls agonistic relations, conflicts with one another, nevertheless, they accepted the constitutional framework as common. They accepted also the possibility of compromise, of making agreements with opposing parties, sometimes forming coalitions with them. Parties under constitutional democracy are important institutions which allow constitutional democracy work as against factions that may have brought down the whole thing. The populist party movement becomes, Urbinati argues, a faction and makes the working of the constitutional structure more and more difficult, even outside of their changing it formally and producing new constitutions and even possibly new regimes. The older one cannot function with a significant part of the political framework, sometimes the government itself, being in populist hands. And so this makes the other parties either unable to operate or become populist themselves, or engage in antagonistic relations which endanger the whole constitutional regime. And you see this kind of story everywhere. Now, of course, the Populist Party will not just accept the fact that there are many factions of which they are one, but they are trying to, because they understand themselves as a part that stands for the whole, they will try to destroy other such part claimants. And so they will do everything to make the life of other parties impossible. Hannah Arendt argues in On Revolution that the logic of multipartyism is one-partyism. It's a strange argument, but I think it is based on the experience of the Weimar Republic, that each of the parties in her Republican depiction, more or less a faction, seeks power in order to eliminate all the other parties and to become the one party. You see this obviously in the Latin American cases. I don't think that ever fully successfully, even Fujimori has to sponsor, and that's of your point, alternative parties to compete. So in some sense, party competition is not eliminated under populism. Of course, it is under fascism, another significant difference. Now, you could say the logic is similar, but populism is bound by its operation within the democratic imaginary. And so it will not fully suppress other parties, even Putin, right? Jails party leaders, and by the way, Erdogan has done that too, with the leaders of the Kurdish Democratic Party. So you jail other party leaders, other party figures, but you don't make the other parties all illegal. You try to somehow create a framework of competition which is more and more illusory. So you try to create some kind of mix, and that mix has to do with the democratic imaginary, has to do with the electoral frame within which that democratic imaginary can be made plausible both to the inside and outside. But whatever it is, it means you try to have your cake and eat it too. In other words, you try to have a one-party system which looks like a multi-party system. That would be, and I think, and here is, my own hesitation with respect to the regime type. It makes the populist regime even a hybrid, and not an outright authoritarian regime. In other words, not a dictatorship, open dictatorship, nor even a fascist regime, but a hybrid, which, however, tries to keep the democratic dimension subordinate or unimportant or illusory even, but nevertheless present. I mean, that's true for, you have to tell me, Cesar, what the current situation would be in Venezuela. I assume that that there are political leaders who are forced into exile and who are even uh, endangered uh, in terms of their security and possibly their
So, some of them are in jail.
in
Yes.
jail, right? And this is, of course, Putin's way, and also Erdogan's way, but it is not Orban's way. You know, it is. There are limits. Now, of course, a special situation in the European Union, you could not start jailing everybody in Hungary without somebody in Brussels or Berlin or Paris noticing, and that's a problem for Orban. It remains a problem. So you do stuff, but you stop at a certain point. But it's a relatively fluid boundary, unfortunately, borderline, or where actually repressive measures will be used directly. So in this sense, uh, the populist regime is a real puzzle because to the extent that it is indeed a hybrid, it can preserve its hybrid quality by some concessions to virtue, as I called them before. So you have an election, you allow other parties to compete. HDP can compete, even though Demirtas is in jail. It's kind of bizarre, right? I mean, how are you going to compete in an election against the president's party and his control of the machinery if your leader, who's a genuinely charismatic figure, Demirtas, is in jail, and Novotny is the same kind of problem. Yet, it is the government that, after all, could suppress the party altogether and jail all its leaders, and doesn't. So, some way, it's a kind of game with international public opinion, with the European Union, with Latin American public opinion, but it's a game that tends to be weighed toward the authoritarian side. That's the trick. And how much the weights on each side, how much you allow. Why should Orban allow Budapest government to be in the hands of the opposition? I mean, there are all kinds of ways we know historically that could have been stopped, right? I don't want to give anybody any ideas here. I'm sure we are monitored, uh, at least in Hungary, because of the ELTE connection, and we could be monitored in some other countries. So I don't want to give anybody ideas here, but yes, there would have been ways. And Erdogan lost Istanbul. There would have been ways he could have stopped it. Ballot stuffing is an old tried method, and there are other ways. But anyhow, it's allowed. It's allowed for also public relations purposes. That's the way to put the Talleyrand point. There is governance and public relations, and governance and public relations must be balanced in some way. I mean, Orban has played this game. He calls it Pavotans, right, Barbara? The dance of the peacock. I don't know where that comes from. That beautiful metaphor. It's a nice, in Hungarian it sounds great. The dance of the peacock. Peacock dance, I guess it would be in English. He did he name it that, Barbara? Did he call it that, or did somebody else give it a name?
I don't know, especially because I use it a lot. So I'm not.
Yeah, well, but I think he's a clever guy, and he may have made it up himself. But this is, I don't know, are the peacocks known for dancing this way? I'm not even sure where this comes from in Hungarian. But anyway, he called it that. And it is this peacock dance between public relations and governance. I mean, you're not going to let Brussels determine governance, but they do affect Hungarian public relations. And that's especially strong, of course, in Europe, right? Because the EU would have all kinds of instruments to intervene. So you really have to be careful. OAS, is not powerful in the same way for Latin America. And of course, Erdogan, well, I guess he has Biden on his neck now. With Trump, he had nothing on his neck. European Union was a bit of a problem, but I think that the chance of joining was gone for Turkey, and so it was not a great issue. But I guess Biden is an issue for Erdogan. So he must make some concessions to the peacock. Or will have to. But of course, it depends on your size, your power, your tradition. I don't think Putin is too worried about international public opinion. Hungary is not Russia. Has a much better economy on a small scale, but nevertheless, it's not a continent. Anybody else?
Yeah, Andrew.
Yes, please.
Yeah, notwithstanding the problem that you've laid out, the one about threshold, but it was not clear to me the analytical distinction between populism as the government and hybrid regime. It seemed to me that the transition from populism in government to the government is already basically hybridization, right? Or no?
Well, of course, here's the thing. We can look at thresholds as ideal types, and we look at them as degrees. And you use the term, beautiful term here, hybridization, very insightfully. Now, of course, from the moment on that you have a populist executive, there's been arguably hybridization. Because for modern government, the executive is much more powerful than it was for 19th century constitutional states. So you capture the executive, whether it is through a parliamentary or presidential way, and you have made your country more authoritarian. Some people think, while Lynch certainly thought so, that presidential government already was a little bit hybrid. So hybridization as a process goes through. I mean, do you have hybridization from the moment that there is a Tea Party, a populist movement? Well, that would be going too far, because this is part of civil society, right? That different political opinions, whatever they are, radical nationalist or whatever, should be able to express their views. So that's not hybridization. But once such a party has the executive, you could call it hybridization. I know I'm dancing away. I'm doing my own peacock dance here. I'm dancing away from your question because you are not focusing on that step. You are focusing on the government step and the hybrid regime step. And of course, I could say it's a matter of degree and dance away from your question. I'm like Orban, I'm Hungarian too. So I learned to do these things, right? But I should address it honestly, because you were asking about the ideal type and not about the degree. With the degree, again, to dance away a little bit, with the degree, you could say, well, once you take over the whole media world, it's not just the three branches of power, it's the media. And, the fourth branch, lots of people call the media the fourth branch. Orban captures the fourth branch. Now that should be already a hybrid regime. Janos Kish would probably be on your side in this question and would say that already when they made the new constitution, they already hybridized the framework pretty dramatically. But here's the question. What would be the character of a different regime than constitutional democracy? So I enter into your world of the ideal types for a second, and I go with Adam Przeworski. Adam Przeworski defined constitutional democracy as a form of regime in which anyone can lose an election. It's a nice book, Democracy and Markets. I still recommend it to you, even though now things have gone so much further in Central Europe. A regime in which anybody can lose an election. And I think that the hybrid regime would mean ideal typically that that those who control the governmental power can no longer lose an election. That would be the ideal typical way of making the difference. Now, of course, when you want to apply the ideal type to any given empirical case, like say Hungary in this particular instance, is it already a hybrid regime like that? Can Orban lose an election? Well, he lost one for Budapest. That could be part of the peacock dance. He allows the Budapest election to be lost, even though he's angry about it. He's not happy. But he allows it to be fair. That's the point. He allows it to be fair. Barbara can tell us whether it was really fair or not. Did they stuff any boxes? Did they cheat at all? Did they use the governmental power? But the outcome seems to indicate they did not. And so you could still lose an election, but was it the national election? Hard to test because the opposition is so inept in some of these countries that you can't blame it on Orban. You can just blame it on the opposition that cannot unite for democracy. If they united for democracy, even under the current electoral rule, could Orban lose? When is the next election, Barbara? 22, right? The next national election.
Yeah,
What?
22 April.
I can't hear you.
April 22, yeah.
22. Okay, so that's the question. If the opposition follows the strategy of Budapest, which was basically unite, even Jobbik supported, if I'm not mistaken, the opposition. Because Jobbik is now to the left of Orban through a peculiar inversion that Orban's radicalization produced in Hungary. If they do that again, which is what they must do, right? If they ask me, if they hire me as an electoral advisor, it's going to be a very simple advice. Do what you did in Budapest and unite for democracy, because all of you can gain in a democratic setup. How much it will depend on the future. But in the short term, everybody gains. And so you must unite to defeat. Can this be done in 22? And this means, of course, CHP and HDP uniting in Turkey. And also there's some smaller parties there. You know, if they did what they wanted to do, could they still win? And I think the answer that Udipta is looking for, ideal typical level, is that that's where the threshold is. And Putin cannot really lose, I don't think, at this point, no matter what the opposition does, because whatever they do, they'll wind up in jail. And so in that sense, that's the threshold. But yes, reality, Max Weber would remind us, even when he develops his theory of the ideal type, is a question of a heterogeneous continuum. In other words, degrees, everything is degrees. And so, yes, I think we can see the problem. And I think I was a little unfair to Kish and Kornay too, because they introduced an attempt at that ideal typical distinction early. And actually, I should recognize that historically it was a matter of degree then. Okay, thank you.